Now, if we're trying to what we call run in the dark or run without a lot of human intervention, if you get the hot folders set up so that they're processing your jobs the way you need them, the next step is to go under Environment, Auto Execution, and click Start. So what that'll do is any job that hits RasterLink will automatically inherit the profiles and general print settings that you've assigned. And if Auto Execute is on, it will immediately attempt to send it out to the printer. So if you have a graphics department that wants to just fire and forget, or the request we have a lot is the design's being done on a Macintosh and we don't really want to know that the PC exists in the building, if that's the case, it can be fully automated up to the point where there's some type of error. So for example, if the file comes over and the media loaded in the machine is too small for the file, that can create a situation where it won't actually fire off. Sorry about that. The folders in conjunction with the favorites are pretty much how we automate RasterLink. Mimaki Engineering does have a full SDK if anybody happens to have developer staff and they want to look at some of the Visual C code. We do have the ability, if you have a flatbed, for example, to pull the flatbed in and out of a remote. If you're using something like an assembly line operation, or we have a couple customers that have robotic arms that may take a tray, place it on a machine. The machine needs to notify them when it's done printing and pull it back out. So be aware we do have a publicly available SDK for communicating with the machines. It's intended more for flatbeds, as the roll-to-roll units don't really lend themselves well to automation processes. They're good for just taking a file and having it immediately print, which is kind of what we demonstrated here. It gets a little more complicated when we've got flatbeds that have to identify when they start a print, when they finish a print, whether or not they're in a remote mode. Next thing we've got is how to set up blades. There's a lot of material on the internet. We actually use the HP plotter pen design from 1980 when drag knives first came out. So these will fit standard HP pen plotters if anybody happens to have one laying around. We have a couple different designs. This one on the screen here is basically a thumb wheel that has a lock screw on it. So we usually unscrew the two of them together, make tiny adjustments to the lock screw back here, and then tighten everything back up. This pictures the inside of the blade holder with the threads. This is with the black piece removed. These are the standard Mimaki SPB 0030 blade they've got inserted in there. Blades are terribly sharp. Try not to push them in with your finger. You want to use some type of solid object just to tap them into the sleeve bearing that's in there. Sleeve bearing lets everything kind of rotate around. And whether you have this style or the single knob version, a single full 360-degree turn of this piece on the back will produce a 0.5 millimeter extension of the blade out of the face on the top. So the next couple slides kind of show how far we want the blade to come out. If we are going through and want to just chop the vinyl and leave the liner intact, we generally want to have the blade at least clear the bottom of the vinyl. The official Mimaki recommendation is to have the tip of the blade run about halfway through the liner. The easiest way I know to do this is to chop out a little tic-tac-toe board. These blade holders are essentially X-Acto knives, so if you hold them at a 90-degree angle to a surface just with your hand with the blade installed in it, and go through and mark off a little tic-tac-toe board, you can try to take the center of it out, and that will tell you where your blade protrusion's at. If you're so deep that you're cutting all the way through the liner, that's too deep. If you're not deep enough and you can't actually remove the square that's been removed from it, then you're a little too shallow. But for pressure-sensitive vinyl, we'd like to be going about halfway through the liner. If we have, and this is normally done with pressure-sensitive vinyl also, but if we have a situation where we're trying to go through the backing material, the blade protrusion has to be low enough to go through the PVC itself as well as the backing product that's on there. Now on roll-to-roll cutters, we call this half cut or perf cut. It's important on a roll-to-roll cutter to leave a little connecting piece so the blade can come down, slice here. If we don't leave this connecting piece, what happens is the rollers that need to hold on to the material will lose track of it. So if it cuts out a square as it's rolling forward, when it rolls backward to cut out the next square, the roller will no longer have anything to hold on to. And what will happen is the media will skew in the machine. So on our flatbeds, we can cut all the way through without needing to leave any connecting pieces. On the roll-to-roll printer, we do have to use this half cut or perf cut option to make sure that we leave a connecting piece in there. It will have to be punched out after it's completely cut, but that's about the only way we can do it for the roll-to-roll options. This is an example of what we can do on a flatbed. So I don't have any need on here to leave a connecting piece. Flatbeds, if you happen to have one of our flatbed cutters, can do what we call a full die cut, meaning it can completely remove the piece from the main body simply because we have a cutting mat that it's resting on. So we don't actually move the media here. We're just moving the blade. Reciprocating is the same idea. We just have a blade that's going across. In this case, it's connected to a motor that gives us a sawing action to go through material up to about 1 centimeter thick, whether that's cork or foam. And these are just some recommended places to start. So if you're not familiar with the cutters, most PVCs or pressure sensitive vinyls can be cut at 80 grams per centimeter squared. These units are just the units that present on most Mimaki equipment. You may get some slightly different looking numbers if you have your machine set to inches, but this is just a chart of recommended pressures, recommended speeds, and offsets. For those of you that may not have used a lot of plastic products, they're fairly uncommon on the solvent printers, but fairly common on our UV machines. Polycarbonates, oriented polypropylenes, and polyethylene generally are going to take somewhere around 180 grams to punch all the way through the material. We don't usually kiss cut these. These are usually going all the way through. This is not a table that's always going to work on every product, but it's a really good place to start so you can see what the cut quality looks like. Make sure your corners are going in. We do get a lot of questions on offset. Mimaki plotters and print and cut units don't enter the blade angle as a degree, so they don't ask for a 45-degree blade or 30-degree blade. What we really want to know is how far from the center of the blade holder or an imaginary axis going through it is the tip of the blade itself. So these numbers, if you're, for example, getting blades off eBay or using another blade, since we use an HP pen mount, they're all kind of interchangeable. Generally, if we have an unknown blade, we'll just change these in increments of maybe 1/10 of a millimeter. So I'll try 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, all the way up through 0.9. And then what we're looking for is how well does it corner. If the corners are kind of rounded off, our offset's too low. If the corners are not cutting at all and you're having to yank them out of the material, generally the offset's way too high. But it's within about 10 test squares, I can usually tell what the offset should be for a blade. If you are using a Mimaki blade, which of course we recommend, the offset will be listed on the blade holder. The other common question is, how do I move my software from one PC to another PC? I would suggest reaching out to our support line for this, but these are just some tips to kind of take a look at if you're thinking about doing this. Number one, RasterLink has a built-in job backup and restore function. So if you look at RasterLink, right down here on the side, you have a little backup the job and restore the job. You can back it up using this icon. And it not only backs up the job or restores it, but it also backs up all the print settings you have associated with it, all the favorites, and your relationships to a jig you might have made. The other thing we run into here a lot is if you're somebody that likes to store their files in the RIP, it's one of the least safe places to keep your files. RIPs can be pretty abusive to computers. They do a lot of disk reading and writing. They use a lot of processor time. If I mentioned that and you're kind of looking at your RIP and you have 700 jobs in there, keep in mind if you want to keep those files, it's a good idea to back them up or keep the files somewhere other than the RIP, just in case the RIP station has some type of a problem. But if you are going to transfer PCs, first thing is back up all the jobs. Second thing you want to do is deactivate the license. So in your start menu for RasterLink, there'll be a license application. Be sure, one, that you're online, and then go through and run a deactivation. If you uninstall the product or you sell the PC off while the license is activated, we do have a way to do that on the web, but it's much easier to not have to type in the key and just deactivate it before it's removed from the machine. Copy the previous installation. So unless you've told it otherwise, RasterLink will install itself on C drive under the MIJ Suite folder. You'll see some other MIJ Suite folders on there, MIJ Suite Web with some other information. All you need is this one. You'll also need a copy of all the profiles that are installed in RasterLink. Those can be found in the profile folder. You'll need to make sure you have device profiles as well as input profiles. Go to your new PC. What you want to do first is copy all these over to the same location on the new PC. At this point, reinstall the software and then activate the license. If you're going to be restoring your print jobs from up here, when you add your printers, make sure they have exactly the same name that they had on the old PC. So if it was capital CJV300, on the new PC, make sure you name that same printer capital UCJV300. Now, at that point, you will have installed on top of the previous installation on the new PC. 90% of the work is done with one exception. The profiles, even though you copied them over, will not be added to the database on the new install. So under the Start menu for RasterLink, there's a program in there called Profile Manager. You're going to have to point it at this location and this location and have it import all the profiles so they're available to the database. This little section is a lot of information, and there's a lot of gotchas here. As I mentioned earlier, I will provide a PDF link so you can download this. I would strongly suggest calling our tech support line, though, so we can kind of walk you through this process, though. It obviously is kind of a pain in the butt to take all the work that you've had for the past few years and then move it over to a PC and have to start all over again. But give us a call. We'll be happy to walk through that with you. These are just some contact points, our North American websites. For those of you that maybe, like all of us are, probably going through an interesting time with the COVID-19 situation, any tips and tricks or outreach programs we're doing can be accessed here. We also have a lot of video guides. Some of this material I could probably spend 45 minutes on pretty easily just on cutter blades. So if I skipped over anything that was important to you, I would recommend taking a look at resources or reaching out to our call center. And last thing that'll be on here is links to our YouTube channel, specifically some of the ones that we referenced in this presentation for the tiling. I didn't get too much into jig print at all here, and the micro factory videos for how to actually produce some of this stuff. So these will be additional resources. This down here is the Google Drive share link for this PDF. I'll be pasting that into the chat window. Actually, I'll do that now. Hugo, do you want to start in on the questions? I'm going to paste this into the chat window so they can access the PDF.
Okay, we have two questions that we'd like to answer. Well, I'd like you to answer, Evan. The first question comes from NTechAm, and they're asking if auto cleaning works while the printer is in remote.
Auto cleaning will still run while the printer's in remote. If you're asking because you're in a situation where you've shut down your office, though, the biggest thing to kind of watch out for is make sure that your inks are higher than 10%. And if your machine is tracking the ink just through a counter like a JV300 does, make sure your wasting tank is emptied and that counter is not close to 100%. Those are the biggest tips I can give you. It will go through normal cleaning. The only exception to that is if it has received a job and the job has not completed. So if it's in remote, it received a job and it paused in between, at that point, it's not going to perform its auto cleaning functions. Do we have anything else show up on there, Hugo?
And we have another question from Doug, and he'd like to know, can you describe how to zero the cutter blade? he's having to offset his cuts on the printer.
There's a couple different ways to do this. So I don't know if we made it worse or better, but if you take a print and cut job, and you go over on your CJV 300, if you're in general print, now this only works with a print and cut job because you have to access it from the cut edit tab. We have this guy right here. So originally zeroing out the blade had to be done by a technician. And what we do is go into service mode on the machine. When you go into service mode, there's an option in there to basically zero out the cutter with the mark sensor and the cutter with the print head. Because that required service mode and it was kind of difficult to do, we created this print and cut origin adjustment. And you can either fire this off as a print and cut or a print and cut with register marks. So we do recommend, even if you're not using RasterLink, I'd still highly recommend installing it just to have access to this thing. It will go through and print this, cut it, and it's a little hard to see on my screen, but it actually gives you in tenth of a millimeter offsets how far off the cut's going to be. Now, the only trick with this is on your machine, there's a couple different places to put this in. If you're doing a print and cut without registration marks, you have to type this into the resolution you just used. So we can store a set of these numbers for 360 DPI, a set for 540 DPI, and a set for 720 DPI. What we see a lot is they will run this pattern, come up with the numbers that need to be on here, and then type them into the wrong resolution, or the next resolution that prints isn't the one that they did this adjustment off of. Now, when you run this, it's going to use whatever resolution the job you had selected when you went to this screen is going to use. Register marks, if you do run it with register marks, it is resolution independent. It does depend on the digital sensor we use to pick up the mark being, number one, clean, and two, able to pick up the marks on there. If you're in a situation where you're running it and you're seeing offsets that are greater than about 0.5 millimeter, we would like you to reach out to a call center and we can walk you through some steps. Also be aware on solvent printers that the solvent ink and PVC themselves have a shrink and expansion rate of about 0.5%. So it's very common, we'll get a call that the cut isn't going right. And the problem is really that what's printing is not the size it was on the PC. And unfortunately, that is the nature of solvent printers. The ink does attack PVC. That's how it etches into the surface. So PVC print sizes will very often, with the heat needed and the ink, be a different size than what was on the PC. This can be scaled to adjust, but if you're having problems, be sure to get a ruler out and check to see whether the cut is the thing that's off or the print is the thing that's off. We have methods to correct both of those.
Okay. We do have two more questions. I think both of them. Actually, Sarah's question regarding getting square corners. We can provide a link in Google Docs that'll explain how to set the overcuts so that you get a more square corner. We'll include that in the Google documents. And Don's asking about setting the Pantone replacements, which we did review a little bit, but we may not.
Well, no, that was entirely my fault. I had this working last night. For some reason, the CJV, I could have sworn I had the icon over here, and I don't. Let me make sure I open the right version of the file. I renamed some of the stuff you sent me, Hugo, so it's a little off. Hang on a sec here. Let me reopen this and make sure I have the file I thought I had. CJV 300, environment, printer management, function icon is checked. All right, let me try it on this other window and see if I can get it to roll. So what I did on this is I actually have a Pantone that's correctly named and a Pantone that's incorrectly named. What I'm monkeying with over on this 300 is my color replacement icon is not showing up. I don't want to shut down and restart in the middle of the presentation. What should happen though is you should bring in, it's getting the Pantone here, and I think for some reason I'm opening the wrong file. Check something here. Yeah. I think I made a mistake when I built the file on here. So I named this one Pantone 1797C to make sure the replacement was working. And then I added one that was 1797CC, which wouldn't have a match in the library. Normally what you do though is if it's exactly the same name as the Pantone from the color collection, it should automatically replace the value. Hugo, do you know off the top of your head, do we have any YouTube links that go through Pantone replacement at all?
I don't off the top of my head, but I do believe that we have a how-to paper or a white paper, which those should be available on the resources page as well.
All right, let me
I
go ahead.
think it may not be putting out the color values out there. I believe it needs to be
This one I had renamed wrong on purpose just to demonstrate what would happen if it was on, but I think what I did is I overwrote the wrong one to both of them. So I should have 1797 and 1797CC. So let's see. Let me try to overwrite this Mimaki with the right spot color. My guess is I used the wrong one twice. All right, I'll save. While I'm needlessly playing around with the computer, are there any other questions up there?
Sarah is asking about achieving square corners on cuts.
The biggest thing I look at is if you're using a roll-to-roll cutter, make sure the offset's correct. So I would do a 1 inch by 1 inch, just straight cut square, fire it off, and try it with an offset of, I'd do like 0.2 and then 0.4, 0.6, and 0.8 for offset. Take a look at and see which one's got the squarest corners. And then from there, you may need to get down to whether it's 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, and you can even go so far as like 0.785 or 0.8. A lot of it depends on blade condition. If you have a magnifying glass, take a look at the very tip of the blade and make sure it comes to an absolute corner. If it looks ragged, the blade is probably broken and will not corner well. And then the last step you can do is what Hugo was mentioning. We do have a function called overcut, where it takes every line in the vector image and cuts it slightly longer than intended, 1 or 2/10 of a millimeter, so that it's easier to remove the piece. Sometimes we'll use that if we're doing sans serif fonts or anything with a lot of curves to it that come to really sharp corners. Those can be difficult to pull out. Those would be the main tips that I'd look at. Let me pull this Black Raven in one more time. All right, so that is what happens if you have a correctly named Pantone. So without having to do anything else in color collection or telling it to manually replace, it will already have determined what the lab value is from the built-in Pantone library. And now what does happen with Pantones though is this will be as accurate as the output profile you're currently using. So if you're having difficulties getting a Pantone to hit right where you need it, normally we can get to within about a delta E of 2 on Pantones, and we can cover about 95% of the Pantone coded library. you're having problems with it, feel free to reach out to tech support. We do have tools like TeamViewer where we can kind of show you on the computer where all the boxes are to check. So the only difference between the previous one and this one is I spelled this correctly without the extra C at the end of it, so the lookup happened. On the previous file, I had the a double C right there, which isn't a match for anything in our Panzone collection. All right, I'm a little over right now, and I'm getting close to 2 o'clock, and I've got to jump over to another webinar. I'm going to paste the Google Docs link in there. And Hugo, if you have anything else that may address some of these questions, I think the Google Docs link links to a folder, so we can add stuff there. If you want to email it over to me, I'd be happy to put it up there.
Okay, great.
All right, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. I know everyone's busy and has people to manage and work to do, so thank you very much. I really do appreciate all the patience with our presentation, and I hope it was helpful for some of you. And please see the last 2 slides on there. I realize some of this was just a brief overview. A lot of those links do have significant additional details about some of what I was demonstrating on the machine. But thank you, everyone, for your time. I really do appreciate it.